Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of the IEHA Spring Virtual Conference. We will begin momentarily. We're going to have all food CEUs today. Also, if you are looking for the CEU form or the any of the other forms for the conference, those are now available on our website under the conference registration tab. Hope everyone enjoys today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Stephanie Street with the Peoria City County Health Department. I'll now turn it over to Stephanie.
All right, and hopefully everyone can hear me. It says you cannot start screen sharing while the other participant is sharing. There we go. All right, is this working appropriately? Can everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about cold brew coffee. It is something that has really gained in popularity, probably this week with daylight savings time, even more so than usual. I know I've had some extra this week, but talking just a little bit about the food safety concerns that are associated with it. I am Stephanie Street from the Peoria City County Health Department. And just for a quick overview of knowing kind of where I'm coming from and where we are almost central in the state. We have around 1,100 food service establishments. In 2021, we did around 2,000 inspections. On an average year, it's closer to 3,500 to 4,000 food inspections of those establishments. We have a director of EH with 3 coordinators. I am the coordinator of the food program. And then we have our Lead Safe program area. We have an environmental health training specialist and outreach person. And then 10 environmental health specialists / practitioners who do all programs, and 2 environmental health specialists that are primarily for the Lead Safe program. We typically do quite a few temporary food events. Those are down, through the pandemic. 1,100 on an average year. Last year was around 700. And then our water well and septic things that we do are pretty average. I would say we have 20 different townships, and primarily all of those occurrences are in 19 of them. The one township is mainly the city of Peoria, and that's where probably 90% of our food establishments are located. So just a brief overview. This is just a half-hour long presentation just to sort of introduce some information on cold brew. So a little bit about the history and background of it. I love history. A little bit about the food safety risks and when there might be a HACCP or variance needed. And then just some tips on inspecting establishments that might produce cold brew. So the first important question, is cold brew coffee a TCS food? A time temperature controlled for safety food? They actually are, or it actually is, I should say. It can be a little controversial, but the roasted beans, they are a plant food that's heat treated. As we know, they have a very low water activity when they're dry, so when they're actually the roasted beans. But once they get infused in the water, the pH and water activity can run in that range where product assessment might be required to determine if that food can limit pathogen growth and toxin formation. So just for some information on the pH and water activity of a roasted coffee bean, The pH is pretty similar to cold brew coffee. The biggest difference is where that water activity comes into place. So the water activity of cold brew in particular puts it right at that product assessment range. So the differences, there actually is a pretty big difference between iced coffee and cold brew coffee. So those of us who are coffee aficionados or drink it every day probably know some of this. I even learned a little bit more about it during this. But typically there was hot coffee and iced coffee. Both of those were made by brewing beans with extremely hot water. With the iced coffee, it would literally just be that hot product that was left over with ice added. But for cold brew, a lot of people do that where cold water is poured over the roasted ground and steep for 12 to 24 hours, which we would like to see under refrigeration. But a lot of places, if you look at Pinterest or any recipe guides, will tell people to do them at room temperature. And that could be for up to a whole day. Hot brewed coffee, we don't really worry about it. It's brewed very hot. It has that extra kill step. It's maintained hot. You're not getting a cup of coffee at 100 degrees. So it's normally served between 155 to 175, and it's going to be within 1 to 2 hours of brewing. Anyone who's left a cup of hot coffee sitting around, even if you try to reheat it later, it just doesn't have that same taste to it. So a lot of the risks that may be present in hot coffee are prevented by time and temperature. Iced coffee, similarly, a lot of times people will keep that held under refrigeration. And it's also normally served within just a few hours of brewing, because like that hot coffee, it will start losing that flavor and start getting more bitter as time goes on. But with cold brew, because it's brewed cold, it never has that hot temperature. It actually can last much longer. It can last for days. It's smoother, it's sweeter. The bitterness doesn't come on as quickly. So they should be controlled by time or temperature or time and temperature, but often people are extending the shelf life of the cold brew coffee and treating it the same way as iced coffee. So the history, I'll be brief with this, but I think it's kind of interesting. Originally came from Japan. So there were Dutch traders that were inspired by how the Japanese did their cold brew tea. So they would have a contraption similar to this shown on the screen, where there would be cold water and it would flow through these beans until a nice cold concentrate dripped out very slowly. It could take 1 to 2 days for it. But they realized that it actually made a concentrate that was really good. So the Dutch took that and said, well, if they can do it with tea leaves, I bet we could do it with coffee. And then we could have it on our long voyages where we can't have fire because it's dangerous on a ship to make coffee. That continued. There's in the 1840s, there was an original iced coffee. It was a war thing where soldiers at a fortress kind of made up this coffee that during hot seasons would be a sweetened concentrated, where they would still get the caffeine from the coffee, but in a colder version. The 1920s to 1950s, there were some things going on in Cuba where some of the finely ground coffee was run through filters with cold water and repeated until a concentrate was made. And then in the 1960s, something called the toddy was created, which was one of the first cold brew systems. Now we know in the 90s, coffee concentrate like this was made for blended drinks like frappuccinos, and it just took off. So in 2015, all 13,000 Starbucks locations started selling cold brew. And in 2017, cold brew sales grew by 370%. Now we see it almost everywhere. McDonald's has cold brew, Dunkin' Donuts has cold brew. You go to the gas station, a lot of those have a cold brew machine on the counter. And from what I found out, almost every place does it a little differently. So some of the places that are calling it cold brew, it is done more similar to iced coffee. And then other places are actually cold steeping. So the top 3 food safety concerns we have with cold brew, one is temperature abuse that can allow for that increased risk of growth of microbes, sanitation concerns. So during the processing, during packaging. A lot of places have started to make their own cold brew and bottled it, especially during the pandemic, for people to come and pick up when their establishment wasn't open for indoor service. And then lack of knowledge. So a lot of those risks are hard to manage if people aren't aware that they exist. So for temperature abuse, if the cold brew isn't handled at 41 degrees or less and date marked for no more than 7 days from the date of production, there can be different pathogen growth in it. So yeast, bacteria, mold, those all can survive at the ambient temperatures. And then, as we know, listeria can even survive under refrigeration. So I mentioned on here that there was a challenge study showing that listeria survived for up to 3 weeks in refrigerated cold brew coffee. Sanitation concerns. So that coffee roasting process destroys some of the pores, but with cold brewing, there's not that 200-degree water involved. Cross-contamination can occur if it's not being cleaned, sanitized properly in between steps. It could come from the water, making sure they're using the right type of potable water, the equipment, the environment, personnel. And then again, that increase in establishments that are starting to try to bottle their own cold brew. We also have a coffee shop here who does their own nitro cold brew. So some establishments are even starting to infuse their own nitrogen cold brew. Lack of knowledge. This one is probably the biggest one, even for us as regulators. It is a relatively new product type, and it's very easy to consider it like I have, as I've considered iced coffee. What's the difference? Until you really look deep into the process and the step-by-step procedures, there are just little changes that are enough to make it an increase in risk. So unfortunately, it became popular before there was really any research done. So we don't even fully know what all the hazards may be. There have been some studies done. Very few of those are public. So the majority of studies I found, I couldn't even read because they are proprietary. So various cold brew coffee companies that have done these studies, they haven't released them to the public. When we're assessing the person in charge's knowledge, many of them are unaware that there's even a risk. The majority of what we hear is, it's just coffee. It's the same as coffee. Why would there be an issue with coffee? We've drank coffee for hundreds of years. We've never had an issue with it. And then we may not know the risks that are associated. And if we do, we may not have decided how to effectively regulate it. So some options, when I've gotten plan reviews and there are coffee shops that are wanting to do cold brew, just asking them particular questions and going over different things they can do. So the easiest one, and the one I often recommend, is just do the entire process under time and temperature control. Cold brew under refrigeration, store it under refrigeration, and then dispose of it within 7 days from the date of production. Another option that a place could do is perhaps when they're using a working supply, so they may brew it under refrigeration, they may store it under refrigeration, but a place like Starbucks, for instance, will take out a liter or two at a time and keep it on a counter. So when they're having a rush, they're making it from the counter rather than getting it in and out of the fridge. They could potentially do procedures, follow time as a public health control procedures, and just make sure either the 4 or 6 hours, depending on if they follow B or C of the Illinois Food Code, they could potentially do that. And then the other option would be product assessment. So they could do product assessment and determine that it's a non-TCS item. I haven't had any that have wanted to do that so far. The ones that I've talked to have all decided to do time and temperature control. So there is a time when a HACCP plan and variance could be required, and this would be with reduced oxygen packaging. So we have had a few places that have wanted to package their own cold brew coffee or nitro cold brew coffee and sell it. And a lot of it will depend on how they do it, what procedures they follow, and how long they're keeping it bottled. So if they were doing it without the following, they would require a HACCP variance. If they were not labeling it with the time and date, if they weren't holding it for 41 or less during refrigerated storage, and if they weren't removing it from the package within 48 hours after packaging. One place that we have, they basically put a 2-day mark on it. So they make it, they bottle it. They've used it a lot at different farmers markets where they've sold it, and they basically make enough just to bring to that farmers market. They make it the day before, take it to the farmers market, and then whatever they don't sell, they're getting rid of. So they don't hold it more than the 48 hours. Again, it's not required if they follow all of that under 3-502.12 F1, 2, and 3. So label production date and time, hold at 41 degrees, and remove from packaging within the 48 hours. When inspecting establishments with cold brew, a lot of it is going to be about questions. So asking them, walk me through these steps. How do you produce cold brew? What equipment do you use? How long do you brew it for? Where do you brew it? In the walk-in cooler, in the fridge? Do you brew it at room temperature? If you're doing anything at room temperature, what public health control measures are you taking? Are you using time as a public health control procedures? Are you following them? The containers they make them in, are they date marking them? And are they date marking them appropriately? What different food safety sanitation practices are in place? And then especially if they're infusing with the nitrogen, it does need to be food grade nitrogen, and making sure it is NSF equipment that's being used. So it's not a rig they're creating themselves that may not be made of food grade material. Or it may be something that's not really meant to be reused and can't be properly washed, rinsed, or sanitized. Cross-contamination, that's another concern. How is the equipment and utensils being cleaned and sanitized before use? So a lot of this equipment can be fully broken down and put through a 3-compartment sink. Some of the places we've talked to weren't really doing that because they considered it like the way they treat hot coffee. And a lot of times those machines aren't fully broken down and cleaned. They're just wiped down, and then maybe an Ernex or some kind of powder or cleaner is used in the actual basket. Making sure potable water is used, good food safety practices are followed. You want to make sure the coffee beans that are used are roasted and not raw. And then that the coffee beans are protected the entire time from receipt through storage and service, because you're not going to have that extra protection of brewing over it at 200 degrees. So if some sort of chemical or something got into those beans, if you're cold brewing, it's going to be left in the concentrate that you have. And then asking about bottling. So are they ever bottling for retail sale? A lot of places seem to do this more on a weekend or a grab and go time where they might have a lot of people in that want to take one home for the weekend. So looking for empty containers like this might be a sign of it. They sell a lot of these plastic containers at a very low price. Any of the labeling we've seen, that's how we've discovered some, is when we find some labeling for cold brew coffee. Glass bottles are relatively inexpensive. We've seen some places using those. So just looking for any of those signs that someone may be packaging these items. And then, is it being removed within the 48 hours after packaging, or are they keeping it for extended periods of time? And that will help determine if they need a HACCP plan or variance. All right, and I know that that's a quick topic that can sometimes be a little controversial, but does anybody have any questions at this point? Does anybody want coffee now? And yes, we can provide copy of the slides. I I put some further reading items. There are some pretty interesting articles about it that go more into depth. And then I included the one study that actually does exist that's public, done by Cornell University. There really aren't many others that are available publicly. Okay, if we don't have other questions, Rachel, do you want me to proceed to my next one, or do we want to break in between those two?
It looks like we just got one question in the chat. Do you recommend any additional labeling or warning statement on bottles to consumers that they must open and consume the bottled coffee within 48 hours?
I think it would be a good idea. None of the documents that I read so far recommended that. It just essentially was whether they would have to have a HACCP or ROP. Really, we would want them to consume it within the 7 days. So I don't think it would be bad to have a date mark on them that says, you know, consume this within the 7 days from production, because that's when we start really worrying about the exponential growth. The 2 days is really just to keep the establishment from having to have a HACCP or variance for it.
Looks like we had another question. Did you find any FBI related to cold brew?
I did not see any, and I don't know that people would normally attribute it to it. There were in the studies, all of it was controlled, so not actual human cases of it, but more testing after so many days to determine what is possible to grow there and how much would grow.
Dial 6520.
Sorry.
Jay, please dial 6520.
There was the inference made that they were the amounts that could make someone sick, but it was basically more of studies that were done to see what would still grow after so long. And there was growth of different pathogens at room temperature much quicker than under refrigeration, but even under refrigeration, after so many days, you still saw that exponential growth of different things. And yeah, I think a lot of it probably is, as Sandra said, that people wouldn't normally think it would make them sick. Just like when we take foodborne illness complaints and we ask about, well, what did you drink? I don't know, water or something. Did it have ice? You know, and people kind of seem weird about, like, why are you asking if I had ice in my drink? Why are you asking if it was a soda fountain? People, I think, kind of assume that you don't get sick from drinks like that. So I don't know that people would normally suspect cold brew. But yeah, it'd be interesting to know if there were particular cases of it now that it's kind of exploded on the market.
All right, thank you. Why don't we go ahead and take a break until 1:30, and then we'll start your next presentation on community refrigerators.
All right, thank you.
All right, it's 1:30, so we'll go ahead and get started with our next session, community refrigerators, and I'll turn it over to Stephanie.
All right. And I'm assuming I'm still sharing my screen and you can see what I'm seeing. All right. So community fridges. Let's get into it. So what is a community fridge? First off, here's a picture of it, and the picture or the screen before this.
Sorry to interrupt. It looks like we're still seeing your previous presentation slides.
Oh, okay. Let me reshare, and maybe that will help.
Yes, we can see it now. Thank
Slowly
you.
coming up. All right. So this first page is just one picture of a community fridge that we're going to talk about. And this is another one that I think is beautiful. These get very fancy, very pretty. So what is a community fridge? They're also called fridges, and it's a mutual aid project, that allows food to be shared within a community. And the overall idea is pretty simple: of leave what you can, take what you need. During the pandemic, there was a very large emergence of these community fridges around the world, and especially in the United States, due to increasing food insecurity, which still exists. One of the first community fridges in the United States was put together in New York City in 2020. So a lot of this for our particular communities are kind of newer. It's only been in the last few years. But as of September of 2021, so just a few months ago, there were 70 fridges in New York City, 14 in Los Angeles, and I was very surprised to find out that there are 26 in Chicago. So some of the factors influencing the rise in these community fridges, they did originally start in the UK. There was a big push for them, spread to New Zealand, and now to the United States. But two of the biggest factors seem to be the increase in food insecurity overall, and then the increase in public awareness of food waste. So more people having food insecurity and more people being aware of how much food is being wasted overall. Food insecurity is that state of being without reliable access to a sufficient quantity of affordable and nutritious food. So it's not just having zero food, but it's also the idea of only having access to chips and gas stations as grocery stores close, or as produce and fresh foods are not available close to people. So pre-pandemic, 2019, there were approximately 35 million people, 11 million who were children who were food insecure. Post-pandemic, 2021, approximately 42 million people and 13 million children who were considered food insecure. There's been approximately a 55% increase overall in people seeking aid from food banks and food pantries since 2020. And that is from feedingamerica.org. There is a whole study they did on those. And a lot of the statistics are pretty staggering, but really we don't need the statistics. We see this every day. I mean, a lot of us have even experienced this during the pandemic. And food waste or wasted food is any edible food mass anywhere along the food chain. The US wastes up to 40% of its post-harvest food supply. There was a study in 2015 that examined different consumer awareness, knowledge, attitudes, behaviors related to wasted food. And what they discovered is that consumers are definitely aware that food waste is an issue, and the majority are interested in waste reducing behaviors. Some other things that come up that have kind of emerged more recently are the misfit markets or imperfect produce. So those subscription packages where they're sending out some of the produce that gets overlooked or wasted traditionally, just because it doesn't look pretty, even though it tastes fine and is not rotten or bad. The EPA Food Recovery Challenge, Save the Food, which was a national campaign, share tables. We've started seeing those in schools in the last couple years, where instead of getting rid of the items that students aren't eating when they're prepackaged or maybe a whole fruit, we're putting them somewhere else so that other students that may still be hungry could get more food or take food home with them. And then, of course, I believe this started this year, was the Public Act, or 2021, sorry, 102-0359, which required all Illinois school districts to incorporate a food sharing plan for their unused food. So it essentially said that, that unused food can't just be thrown out. We need to find some way to incorporate that into use in the future. So a lot of the questions with these community fridges are multiple questions that come up. What is it? Where do we put it? Why do we need it? When should it be available? How does this work? The questions are kind of endless. But there also are very different concerns and different questions that we ask as regulators versus the people who are organizing them. And some of that requires sitting down and having open and honest communications, because we are kind of looking at it different ways. Although all of us, want to make sure people can eat and obviously have concerns about that, we also worry about the food safety side and the regulatory side. So we might be thinking permit-wise, how could this fridge ever even meet the requirements of our licenses or our codes? And for the community fridge organizers, they're thinking, why do we need a food permit? Do we need one? We're giving this food away for free. A lot of times we're one of the last people, it seems like, that places contact when it comes to this, because they think free food, there isn't that regulatory side of it, and they're more worried about the rest of this. So they're thinking about equipment wise. Do we have fridges people would donate? Where would we get the money to raise this? And we're thinking, is it even safe to have a fridge or freezer stored outside where anyone can get into it? A child could enter it. We're thinking, is this food safe equipment that can even maintain proper food temperatures? Location wise, we might think about zoning. They're thinking, what neighborhood needs this the most? Where is there a food desert that we need to provide food to? Staffing wise, they're always wondering, volunteers, do we have enough volunteers? How do we get volunteers? What do we expect from them? We're thinking, will these volunteers have any food safety knowledge? Will they know how to rotate product? Will they know how to look for the spoiled foods? Do they know how to sanitize? Utilities, we're wondering electrical and fire safety. How do we address those concerns? Whereas for a community fridge organizer, the concern is more, how do we get access to them? If we have these fridges outside, who pays for the electricity? How do we get electricity run out to these fridges? And then food defense. That's the biggest one, I feel like, for us as regulators are, what are they putting into place to make sure that unsafe foods aren't consumed by the public? And they're thinking, who's going to be held liable? What if someone gets sick? Are we covered by the Good Samaritan laws? Can we be held liable legally for that if the food is tampered with? And how do we even prevent that? So there are definitely different concerns. They do align in some ways, but then there are other ones that we may not have thought of that they're thinking of, and ones that we think of that hasn't even crossed their mind. So a big part is breaking down these different codes. They often fall under the jurisdiction of multiple city and county entities. So we're looking at planning and zoning. We're looking from the local health department, food safety licenses. We're looking at building codes, fire codes, different compliance. That's why the biggest tip I've told people that are interested in these community fridges are get all potential stakeholders together from the beginning. And definitely be prepared to be creative and have an open mind, because these aren't shut and dry in most or cut and dry in most places. These are going to be things that there are just a lot of different factors involved. But really trying to go at it from the perspective of how do we make this work instead of this will never work. So that's one of the big ones. Because we've seen, you just take a quick look on Google and you can see what happens when we don't have stakeholders involved from the beginning, when these are just open. It doesn't really go well for either community. So in social media, newspapers, online, what you're going to see is that the people who are regulating definitely end up kind of looking like the bad guys. That's how it's going to be portrayed, because people are trying to provide food. And then the people who are trying to do a good thing, may get some blowback from this in terms of fines, or having to do remodeling, or just a lot of different costs that they didn't even think about. All they were trying to do was, something good. This is one city community efforts to provide free fridges full of food in need is fought by the city. And these are all over. So this is from 6 or 7 different states. A fridge owner that was given warnings by the city health department. East Community Fridge finds a new home after they were threatened to be shut down in Abilene in Texas, various places, and for various reasons. Some were zoning reasons. There was one, I believe in Iowa, where the person, out of the goodness of their heart, went and built a shed in their front yard. Well, the neighbors, if you're not thinking from that perspective, the neighbors aren't really happy necessarily having this fridge that is attracting a lot of people into maybe a quiet neighborhood. And then the sight of, having a shed in front of their house where, if they don't have the right volunteers or the right people to help them keep it up, you may have food that's, dropped on the ground. Maybe someone breaks a glass, maybe, different foods are left or things are discarded. It can create a nuisance for sure, but it's not something you typically think of first when you think about providing food to people. So our first experience in Peoria with it was last year in May. We had gotten a call from someone saying that they had done a fundraiser and raised, I believe, around $5,000 to put up a community fridge, and they had already purchased it. So definitely completely great intentions in mind, but went, right to the end step. She just she wasn't calling about a food safety license. She hadn't even thought of it because the food was given away for free. She was only calling us to make sure they wouldn't be liable for damages. So they had someone tell them, hey, what if someone gets sick after they eat foods from this fridge? Are you covered? And they wanted to know more information on the Good Samaritan Act. So we did sit down and meet with them and discuss all the different aspects of it. But one thing about that Good Samaritan Act is that it does provide protection for individuals when certain criteria is met, but it does have limits. So it's not just a complete free-for-all. When the donation is made to a nonprofit organization for distribution, you are covered, but it doesn't always directly cover donations made to the needy family or individual yourself. It also doesn't waive or override any state or local health regulations. So that is, some of the minor details in it of that act that do apply. So it may seem like an uphill battle when we initially sat down trying to determine, can a community fridge even meet a code? Can meet the codes, all of the codes. So this one is specifically to the city of Peoria, and every county has different ordinances, different zoning laws and things like that. So this won't be applicable to everybody, but this is just our particular situation and how we were able to do this. The first issue that came up wasn't even the health department, but it was actually a city ordinance. So we had at least 2 children, unfortunately, who perished within a 2-year period after climbing into fridges that were left abandoned outside of houses. So a fridge, I believe, that was left in an alley and kids were playing hide and go seek. Someone got in there, got trapped, because older fridges don't have a mechanism where you can unlock them from inside. So the city of Peoria has its own ordinance that you cannot leave any refrigerator or freezer outside the four walls of a building where it's accessible to children. So that was the first issue that came into place was, you can't even have that refrigerator outside of there. They had already purchased this refrigerator, and it just happened to be one that does not have a mechanism that unlocks from the inside. Also under our own code, we would require licensure since they were wanting to do time as a temperature control foods. So if they were just doing whole uncut fresh produce and shelf stable items, they wouldn't necessarily have to have a license from us, but they were wanting to be able to do eggs and milk and eventually get licensed establishments to donate items like Chick-fil-A to donate chicken sandwiches, Panera to donate items that they had made in their store. So they were wanting to provide those items. But of course, under different codes, you have to have floors, walls, ceilings, pest control. We were concerned about temperature control and monitoring, wondering about who would be the person in charge. What kind of food defense would they have? What kind of trace back if anyone could come and set something in a fridge? How would we ever trace back, what got someone sick? The sources of food, how would we make sure the sources of food are approved? So there were a lot of challenges sitting down initially that we were trying to work through one at a time because we did want to help this happen. So the code of ordinance, that was the biggest one, was not being allowed to have a fridge or cooler outside. And they could have gone outside the city of Peoria and maybe it wouldn't have applied. But this particular place was a church that's located in downtown Peoria where we do have a large unhoused population. And a lot of our overnight type places like the Salvation Army are located in this area. So they really wanted to be here because this was the area where they're seeing the most people on a regular basis in their own neighborhood that needed food. So it was determined that if we could do the fridge installation in a commercial zoning, so not a residential where there might be neighbors who are not happy about having all this extra traffic. If they could find one that had that internal safety mechanism so that if a person did climb inside, they'd be able to get outside. And if the electrical system was installed so that it could handle outdoor elements and would not significantly increase a risk of a fire hazard. So it was determined if we could meet those three things with what they came up with, the city zoning would be okay with it. In terms of our license, that was the next part we looked at. And we gave 3 different potential options that could work. So one was do things that don't require a license. And that is what they initially thought of doing to open it up and then eventually add other things. But based on the people in their neighborhood and what they talked to them and the feedback they got, there was really a strong desire for other foods other than just whole uncut produce and non-time temperature controlled for safety foods. In addition, they had raised that $5,000 for a fridge. And so they felt like it wouldn't be right to not provide some of the things that they had raised that money based on. A vending machine. It would seem like a wild idea, but it was an idea we had that maybe if they purchased a commercial vending machine that can be stocked with those TCS foods, the prepackaged ones, and they could restock it if the person in charge had a key. Those are temperature monitored. So if it falls if it rose above 41 degrees for a certain amount of time, those turn off automatically so that people can't get things out of them. And they did seriously consider that at one point, but it was going to require a lot more oversight and volunteer staffing that they weren't sure that they would have to be able to do that. And then the last option we had was, since this was a church, they did have a kitchen, there was the potential to have a food safety license, and then we could do a variance to have an outdoor unit. So that would involve bringing the church kitchen up to code, licensing it, and then applying for a variance to operate an outdoor cold holding unit, similar to like an outdoor bar or grill. And that outdoor area would still need to meet the Peoria County Code and Illinois Food Code. But we thought this could be a good way for them to also be able to make some foods if they wanted to restock the kitchen. And then, or sorry, the fridge. And then they would also have access to 3-compartment sink and sanitizer and all those supplies that they need close by, as well as they have visual monitoring outside here where people that work at their front offices can watch this at all times, that the church is open, so that if they need to go out or they see something going on, or that, you know, they can regularly go out and restock this unit. So they did decide that they would like to get the license, and they went for a high-risk license because they wanted to be able to do soups and chilies and things that they would cool down and package. So it required the submission of a plan review application with the variance request. The kitchen inside the church had to be brought up to code. It was a really nice kitchen, and thankfully all it needed was one more hand sink and then a mop sink. We required the fridge itself to be able to be fully enclosed, so that it could be locked and made inaccessible when there is nobody who could monitor it. Also to keep pests from getting in, and have some form of protection from outdoor elements when they're not having it open for people. We asked them to set some sort of operating hours when staff would be available. So even if a staff member isn't able to sit out there next to the fridge the entire time, which we knew was hard to expect, they could at least go out regularly, clean, move product around, just kind of check that the things being donated are things that are allowed. We asked them to only allow donations of prepared foods if they were prepared, packaged, and labeled in a licensed kitchen. So no home cooked meals from someone's home. Required a person in charge that has food safety training, and then required that during those operating hours, they would monitor temperatures on a log. They would clean and sanitize the fridge. They would check for improperly labeled items, spoiled items, discard as needed, and then arrange foods to avoid cross-contamination. So we did quite a few meetings with them and went over things like, you know, if you get eggs donated, have eggs, you know, on the bottom shelf so they don't break and, you know, run onto ready to eat foods that are underneath. Just went over a lot of different food safety things that they hadn't thought of. And they were very appreciative and easy to work with. They wanted to do this right, and they wanted to do the right thing. So that really helped. And the final product was our first community fridge, which is called the Riverside Community Church Fridge. It's very pretty. You can see it from the street. It's right in downtown Peoria. They have a list of items they accept in it. And they base that on a booklet that was made, I believe, in the UK, that has really great information about putting these fridges together and how to run them. And it's been really successful so far. They've had a lot of good donations. They keep the fridge really nice and clean, and they have a lot of visitors there that are really making use of it in an area that just doesn't have grocery stores available, and they don't have fresh produce available. So I know a lot of the people they have come through are actually kids. After kids get out of school, they'll come there, they're hungry. Maybe their parents are working and they don't have anyone at home that is, you know, getting food for them or able to make food for them. This gives them another option. They can come by here and grab a granola bar and an apple, you know, or something like that, and have some fresh food to eat. And these are some pictures of other fridges that I've found, including that community fridge guide that's from the UK that has a lot of really great information. I did find out the 26 in Chicago, the ones she had based them on. In Chicago, they are considered exempt, I guess, from licensing. So this really will depend on your county and what kind of rules you have yourself and how you define food establishments. And that's all. Does anyone have any questions about community fridges? This little avocado one is actually my favorite, but if you look up community fridge on Google, there are just hundreds of pictures of them and they get very, very creative. And there are some interesting little locations they have these in. It looks like a lot of times they'll talk like a little bodega or corner grocery store place or a corner gas station or convenience mart. They'll ask them to donate the use of electricity for the fridge, and they provide the fridge and they provide the volunteers that come in and clean it out, and the community place basically donates the electricity and lets them be on their bill. So it's a nice community venture.
Stephanie, it looks like we had one question in the chat. Any thought of having IDPH create rules or guidance for the community fridge so they are handled the same across the state?
I think that would be amazing if we had a standard. I think it would be hard because of how different each county is. For instance, like I said, in Chicago, these aren't licensed because they're considered exempt. So I don't know that they get inspected, whereas we inspect some. And I found there were a couple other I saw in Illinois. I'm sure more of these exist than we know about, because it's not something that people generally reach out to us for, I think, because they do think, oh, it's free. It's just a fridge. We're just donating stuff. We don't need a license. But yes, it would be definitely nice to have some kind of standard, because I think they are going to increase. Food insecurity is just getting worse, and gas prices are going up. All the prices of everything is going up. So I can see these exploding. And I know the biggest thing for us is we want people to be able to have access to these nutritious foods. And it's a great concept, but making sure we're not creating any other risks that are worse. We don't want people that are already disadvantaged that may not have good medical coverage to then, get something in one of these fridges that aren't regulated and get sick. And then there's more problems on top of problems added to it. So, I mean, it can't be perfect 100% of the time, but I do think any guidance that local health departments can offer, or even the state, would be amazing, so that people can do this the right way, and kind of plan that food defense side into their business plan for it.
Like we have another question in the chat. What happens when someone gets sick from eating from the fridge? Should they at least be labeled or identified who supplies food?
Yes. So for ours, like I said, I don't know about any other county, but for the ones in Peoria County, we do require that they label those items. So if Chick-fil-A drops off sandwiches, they are supposed to have labels on them. If Panera drops off items, they're supposed to label them. If the church itself, which they do make like peanut butter and jellies in their licensed kitchen and things like that, that they think are popular items that people like, they do label all of those. So there is a way it does provide an answer for that trace back component of kind of figuring out, where someone may have gotten sick from. And they do keep all their temperature logs. So anytime something would come up, they can pull them out and show, we took temperatures this many times this day. Here's the label of, the item, where it came from, and there is sort of that trace back involved with it, which I think is good. The only thing it's not for would be the whole uncut produce. But they also have signs up there to wash it, to make sure people are washing it, since even if they wash those items, everyone that's reaching in there is touching them. So they decided instead to have a sign that says, any whole uncut produce that you get, try to rinse before you eat it, just as a warning. Right. Thank you very much for having me.
Stephanie?
Yes.
Oh, I just said thank you, Stephanie.
Oh, no problem.
All right, our next session is considering a new policy approach for controlling Listeria monocytogenes. It looks like our speaker is Donna Guerin with the American Frozen Foods Institute, and I'll now turn it over to Donna.
Great, thank you. Let me get to, I don't see okay, there we go. I don't see my presentation. 1 second, sorry. Here we go. Are you seeing, oh, share, okay. Are you seeing this, I think? If you could let me know, Rachel.
Uh-huh.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the organizers and my good friend, Stacy Thompson, for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm looking forward to sharing the systematic work that the American Frozen Food Institute that I'm with, or what we call AFI, has done on the science front in an effort to engage the regulatory agencies on achieving a more practical and science-based policies to regulate the presence of Listeria monocytogenes in our food system, both in processing environments and in food. So just an awareness before we get started right now, the policy is a zero tolerance, and we're looking at how can we achieve possibly a different approach. So this a little bit before we get started, wanted to briefly introduce you to AFI, and our vision sees frozen foods as an essential category in a dynamic marketplace. And this was amplified and evident over the course of the pandemic. Frozen foods definitely experienced a growth at unprecedented levels, which frankly has sustained in large part, as we just heard from the last presentation. There, is a tremendous need for food, and there's the existence of food insecurity. So it is important that we have foods like this. So you may recognize some of the many frozen food brands that are on this slide, from frozen vegetables, frozen fruits, frozen meals, side dishes, pizza, and a host of new and innovative products. And I'm proud to represent not only some of the large brands that you see on this list, but also the many small and medium-sized processors that might not have a brand as well. So, and are often co-packers for both retail and some of these larger brands. So we're proud to represent the frozen food industry, small, medium, and large. So overview of our discussion today is Listeria monocytogenes in food production. What is the science and research efforts that we are seeing? And how can we modernize the LM policy to move to an approach beyond zero tolerance that actually may be more protective of public health? And AFI's LM best practices, training, and education, and then we can open it up to Q&A. I would like to, in this presentation, spend more time attempting to converge the science, policy, and industry opportunity and public health risk aspects, not only to formulate a strategy to take the regulators, but also a framework upon which meaningful change can occur relative to Listeria monocytogenes, or LM, in our foods. So a little bit of background of Listeria monocytogenes. I know that this group is probably acutely aware of these kind of pathogens, particularly Listeria monocytogenes, but it is the foodborne pathogen that causes listeriosis. And so these are some of the symptoms: diarrhea, fever, vomiting, muscle aches, and headaches. And it is something that is something to monitor, because it does cause 1,800 illnesses and 250 deaths per year in the United States, and has a greater than 15% mortality rate. So it is something that we need to make sure that we're addressing, and we're looking at this from, what is the best way to address it. So like a lot of pathogens, and, the at-risk groups are immunocompromised, young children, elderly, pregnant women, and neonates. So Listeria monocytogenes, and we heard from one of the previous presentation, it can grow at refrigerated temperatures. We typically see this in deli meats, processed meats, cheeses, unpasteurized milk, seafood, fruits and vegetables, ice cream, and frozen foods. We have seen it in frozen foods, and you can sample many of these products and actually find listeria species. May not be Listeria monocytogenes, but you can definitely find Listeria monocytogenes if you test enough. Listeria monocytogenes is ubiquitous in its occurrence. It can be found in soil, vegetation, water, food processing facilities, particularly cold, wet processing facilities. Processing environments, raw ingredients, human and equipment transmit this, survives freezing and frozen storage. Excuse me. And in the food processing facilities, you really need to have a comprehensive food safety program to address it. And you need to be able to evaluate persistence versus transient transmission of Listeria monocytogenes or Listeria. Because you often see that this can come in through raw ingredients, come in through human or equipment, travel through the facility, but it doesn't persist. But then there's elements where it does set up shop, basically in environments, in a niche environment where it can be very difficult to get rid of because of its ability to form biofilms. So what is the current state? What are we doing now? So the current state is typified by recalls, stimulated by positive findings with no quantitation. Basically, they're not enumerating. Both regulators and industry are guilty of driving the entire food system to the point where it's difficult to distinguish between risk profiles across foods. So they're just doing a positive negative test, and you really don't understand what is the true risk factors associated with its presence. And regulatory authorities, we are seeing a bias towards ascribing high risk to foods associated with illnesses, and the industry faces regulatory jeopardy and taking proactive steps to find and eliminate Listeria monocytogenes in processing facilities. There is undue focus on different food segments to drive Listeria down, but both regulators and industry end up only fighting fires. And all the while, we have learned nothing about defining risk or addressing the root causes. So to summarize this is the current regulatory approach is largely based on the presence of the hazard rather than on the risk of exposure, consumption, and illness. So let's step back and see what the science says. As mentioned, Listeria monocytogenes is ubiquitous in environmental pathogen. So eliminating all potential sources of Listeria monocytogenes is unpractical. If you look for it, you will find it. A recent University of Minnesota study reports Listeria monocytogenes prevalence in food has reduced in the past 5 years, but listeriosis incidence has remained flat, basically no movement up, which is good, but no movement down either. And frankly, the premise that a single cell of Listeria monocytogenes can cause disease does not have much scientific basis. In fact, one of the early risk assessments showed that home refrigerators at lower temperatures would have the greatest reduction in disease incidence. So just lowering the temperature on the refrigerators might do the best in regards to its reduction of cases. So prevalence of pathogen, exposure to high levels of the pathogen, and public health risks are intimately interrelated. So knowing that high levels of Listeria monocytogenes are the real issue and that environmental control is key, what we really need is a systematic process to assess the levels of contamination and understanding of the impact of various modified food exposure circumstances, and a regulatory framework that supports strong environmental monitoring. So with a zero tolerance approach, what's happened is it's led industry to the point of not wanting to look robustly for the Listeria monocytogenes, doing environmental monitoring, but not creating an environmental monitoring program that really seeks and destroys, seeks the organism out so you can create systems to destroy it. So the prevalence of the pathogen, again, is a problem, and we need to create a risk characterization framework for managing LM in foods for low risk foods. So a more practical science-based framework would recognize this dynamic, providing a regulatory action limit for low risk foods, foods that do not support growth, basically, and would engender needed focus on environmental monitoring, create a pathway for risk-based product testing using enumerative sampling plans, such as a 3-class sampling program that is both not only getting whether it's there, but at what level, what's the numbers, what's the quantitation associated with its presence, and to help establish food safety criteria for the industry at the facility and for regulators at the industry level. So you'll see, all these things that we're talking about is, again, to redirect resources in the best approach possible to increase sampling, higher frequency. So for those of you that are familiar with trade association, it's not often that a trade association would go to a regulatory body such as FDA and say, we want more testing. We want the ability to do more testing and more robust testing, not that just says it's positive or negative or presence, absence, but that really truly defines at what level is it present, and better understanding that so you can create in-process control criteria in that environment. So I would be, neglectful in, talking through this, because again, I'll go back to this last slide. So just so you're aware, this is an important thing for us in moving the needle on listeriosis. It seems counterintuitive to ask for a framework that moves away from zero, because there are pathogens out there, such as E. coli 157H7, that you would say zero is an appropriate strategy for that particular pathogen. But maybe not with Listeria and Listeria monocytogenes, because the sheer presence of it does not necessarily equate to risk. It's at what number? And this is universally adopted across the globe in regards to a tolerance leading to more robust testing, not just of the environment, but also a finished product. So right now we're seeing flat numbers. That presence of absence is not necessarily the best criteria. Zero, it might not be the best criteria. But having some number that provides the necessary regulatory framework for encouraging more testing, really understanding the numbers, so that we can see a public health benefit. And this is not just coming from AFI, but we impaneled a team of Listeria experts from around the globe. And these are recommendations that they wholeheartedly agree that possibly having some number other than zero might actually see decline in numbers associated with listeriosis. So it would be a paradigm shift in thinking, but it could actually be the game changer in regards to decreasing these cases across the US. So before I depart, I do want to share some of our ways that we have also tried to get our industry in a place that they could better address listeriosis and Listeria monocytogenes in their food companies, and creating robust food safety programs. And we did this as part of our strategy that includes science, policy, consumer, and customer education. But the development of best food safety practices was an effort that we brought together about 80 food safety professionals that are in our industry, and also academics, to really develop the needed tools to be able to best address Listeria and Listeria monocytogenes in processing environments, and created over 100 different resources in the areas related to environmental monitoring, sanitation, hygienic design of equipment, process validation, and more. And these resources, they were determined when they came together to be able to lift the entire industry, providing these necessary resources, that they be free and accessible to anyone, not just AFI members, but anyone. And really, if Listeria monocytogenes is your pathogen to control in your environment, it doesn't matter if it's frozen or not. These resources actually can be helpful. And so we're very proud of those. They're also, it's a very interactive site. If you go to AFI's Food Safety Zone, type that in, you'll actually pull this up. And you're able to, go to these resources, find what you need, what are the core things that you need to address, and then further resources, in those core areas. And we didn't stop there. We wanted to take those best practices and see how we could further help disseminate the information, not just to those that are in like the food safety space, like the people who are in, joining this conference today, but also the frontline workers. They can be your best way to empower employees to reduce risk. In this case, Listeria presence. So we created, with the help of Alchemy Catalyst, now Intertech, to create Listeria Stops Here. And it's basically 365 days of training in a box. Creates all the tools necessary to very simply talk about how an average employee can help support controls, but also the people who are the trainers, say the supervisor for that shift, provides them the tools of how to actually walk through that training. And finally, one of the other courses that we have, and both Listeria Stops Here and the course I'm about to talk about, are both in English and Spanish. So we want to also be able to elevate those that are food safety professionals and provide them a pathway to becoming a Listeria control specialist. So we created a certificate program with IFPTI to really help them focus in on, as a food safety professional, what should they address and what should they know in the areas of sanitation, hygienic design, good manufacturing practices, process validation, all these things that they need to be aware of in order to effectively control Listeria, and providing that coursework to go through. And there's 5 modules in order to get the certificate program ultimately. But there's also the value of having the freezer management materials, and for frozen, that's pretty significant because freezers in processing facilities can be a source or a niche for Listeria monocytogenes to set up shop. So we've created those coursework, and we've seen that several state Department of Ag professionals have actually taken advantage of the course. So check that out. It's on IFPTA's website, but you can also go from AFI's Food Safety Zone to that course as well. So not only are we trying to change the possible regulatory framework, we also know that there's a role we play in making sure that we're doing our part to control it. We can't just say, give us 100 and enough is enough. We won't do anything. As an industry as a whole, the food and beverage industry, if Listeria needs to be controlled in your environment, you should, have the tools necessary to do so. So with that, I'm going to try to make this as brief as possible and see if you have any questions for me. That's the website for getting the information you need on Athie's Food Safety Zone. Any questions for me? Looks like I have one. Is there a thought on how much is too much Listeria species? Okay, so Listeria species, generally we are advocating for Listeria monocytogenes versus Listeria species. But if you look at the global landscape of Listeria regulations, it is 100 CFU or colony forming units per gram or per mil. So that is the standard. If FDA and ultimately FSIS decide that they don't want to go to 100, I think, and collectively those organizations that are doing quantitative testing, typically they're seeing anything, 50 or less. It is still in regards to micro context, it's still, 1 or 2 logs, but it is again globally accepted that 100 is pretty much the standard. What testing is currently required for Listeria and manufactured food? Just a test for finished product. Actually, FDA and guidance and FSIS, they encourage more environmental testing than finished product testing. You have to have a sampling plan that is very robust to be able to ultimately create a program that you will find it. And I would say that's the same with the environmental monitoring too, but particularly for finished product testing. And this is why we worked with global experts, not only in Listeria, but statistical sampling, to create recommendations for FDA that we do intend to share with other stakeholders, such as the dairy industry, fresh produce, retail, bakers, and the like, to talk about a 3-class sampling plan that actually collects more samples and gets to that point of increasing your ability to find it. So again, it's typically unheard of for the food and beverage sector to come to the agencies, any agency, and say, yes, we want more testing. But we do believe that, with the ability to have a tolerance, you're going to see more, not only environmental testing that, is going to seek it out, but also those that, particularly in foods that do not support growth, you're going to see much more finished product testing in a way that actually can be effective in trying to find it before it would even leave, a processor's facility. Definitely easier to really have that, be within the facility or the manufacturer's control versus out in commerce. So we do believe it could be hugely impactful in changing the paradigm of what we're currently seeing in regards to recalls associated just with the sheer presence of Listeria monocytogenes. And that shouldn't necessarily be the case, such as one of the examples was with frozen biscuits. And I'm not sure of too many Southerners on this call, but a Southerner wouldn't be caught dead basically consuming a frozen biscuit. Those are intended to be cooked. They're not ready to eat foods. And if following those validated cooking instructions, you will take care of the, whatever's present there. But I think also what doesn't do it justice in those recalls, just knowing the sheer presence absence doesn't really help us understand what numbers we actually are seeing when we're doing those kind of sampling at retail, random sampling at retail. Is there a threshold for repeat testing to differentiate incidental Listeria from persistent Listeria? It does require, yes, but it requires significant testing. And there are significant amount of work. We actually funded research done by Cornell University through our foundation that is set up basically a way to really understand if you are seeing a persistence issue. So basically you're seeing the same Listeria monocytogenes versus another, through serotyping, you will see whether or not it's a transient, just you randomly see a transient come through your facility, or if you're repeatedly seeing, particularly in a niche area, the same Listeria monocytogenes that you identify through serotyping, you can determine whether or not it is persistent. But it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort and a lot of testing, and which companies will do and do. Happy to share some of the research that we did with Cornell that led to basically a mathematical model that can actually help a company really better understand how Listeria is being tracked through their facility. So they pair it with environmental testing along with risk assessment model to better understand what's happening in their facility related to how Listeria can move within a facility. Any other questions? Well, I'll share my contact information. Happy to have a chat with you. I know that this is something that often comes up at the Conference of Food Protection in regards to these kind of discussions of, validated cooking instruction, knowing what's ready to eat versus not ready to eat, what truly supports growth, what doesn't support growth, and how you regulate that. This is a good conversation to have between regulators and industry of how we best address controlling Listeria monocytogenes, a really important pathogen to control, so that we can see a downward trend in these cases in the United States. So with that, I'll close and thank again the organizers for including me in this session, and look forward to any other questions you might have once I share my email. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Donna. So we did get done a little bit early with that session. Our next session, it looks like, is scheduled for 3 o'clock, and I don't believe our speaker has joined yet. So why don't we go ahead and take a break, and we will resume at 3 o'clock. Thank you. All right, it's 3 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker, Jonna Johnson with CDC. And her presentation is on the CDC's National Environmental Assessment Reporting System, informing foodborne illness outbreak investigation and prevention.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All righty, and can you see my slides? All right. Well, thank you. I'm with CDC's National Center for Environmental Health, specifically its Division for Environmental Health Science and Practice. We support state and local environmental health professionals, and my team focuses on supporting them in their food safety work. Today, I'm going to provide an overview of our relatively new reporting system for environmental health data from foodborne outbreak investigations. So let's start with some background and review. Ideally, foodborne outbreak investigations involve all three components of the disease triangle. So that would be epidemiologist, collecting data about the host of the foodborne illness, people, laboratorians collecting data about the agent that's causing the foodborne illness, and then environmental health specialists collect data about the environment which allowed the agent to infect the host. Most outbreaks in the United States occur in restaurants. In fact, 75% of the outbreaks that occurred in 2009 to 2015 occurred in restaurants or catering or banquet facilities. During an outbreak investigation, environmental health specialists and public health are typically responsible for visiting outbreak locations, so the restaurants, to try to understand what happened. How did the environment allow the foodborne pathogen to survive or be transmitted? Environmental health outbreak investigators can engage in a number of activities during outbreak investigations. These can include interviewing managers and workers to understand the practices and policies and to determine if any workers have been sick, observing food preparation, reviewing records such as food storage and cooking temperature logs, and conducting environmental sampling for pathogens in the restaurant. These activities taken together can often be called often called an environmental assessment. They're designed to describe the outbreak and identify the causes, the outbreak in the outbreak environment, and identify the outbreak causes in that environment. Data from these activities, analyzed and interpreted in conjunction with data from lab and epi activities, can help investigators identify the contributing factors to the outbreak. Contributing factors are the actions and circumstances that led to the outbreak. 20 years ago, FDA and CDC examined existing outbreak investigation data and identified 32 outbreak contributing factors. These factors are grouped into three categories: pathogen contamination, pathogen proliferation, and pathogen survival. If you can identify outbreak contributing factors, you have a pretty good sense of how and why the outbreak occurred. And you can implement interventions to prevent those contributing factors in the future. Contributing factors are identified in restaurants in about half of US outbreaks. Given the value of contributing factor identification, we'd like to see this percentage increase. Environmental assessments can also identify environmental antecedents, which are the environmental factors that led to the contributing factor. Although data on environmental antecedents to outbreaks have not been collected or analyzed in a systematic way, experts have theorized that they can be grouped into these 5 categories that you see here: people, processes, equipment, food, and economics. So let's look at an example. In 2014, state and local staff investigated a salmonella outbreak in Minnesota. Lab and epi activities identified 36 cases of illness associated with restaurant A. The implicated outbreak vehicle was dinner rolls. Based on information gained from the EPI activities, environmental health staff focus their activities, their efforts, including interviews with workers and a review of food preparation activities on the dinner rolls. These activities found that the same set of brushes were used to butter the dinner rolls and the raw chicken. The restaurant did report washing and sanitizing the brushes between uses. But the main issue was that the same set of brushes were used for raw and ready-to-eat food, which sets up potential issues like using contaminated brushes on ready-to-eat food or washing failures. Environmental health specialists also found that butter product and the brush were being stored in the proofing oven, which was the perfect temperature for salmonella to harbor and proliferate. Environmental assessment activities identified the contributing factor to the outbreak, which was cross-contamination. Environmental assessment activities also identified potential environmental antecedents. Those would be 1, process or people failures. Workers were supposed to wash the brushes between uses, but they didn't. Perhaps because they were busy, they may not have felt like they had time to wash the brushes. And the second environmental antecedent could be lack of equipment. The restaurant did not have separate brushes for raw and ready-to-eat food. The information gained from the environmental health component of this outbreak was valuable. Environmental health staff used the information to implement interventions in the restaurant. The restaurant bought separate, differently colored brushes to be used with raw and ready-to-eat food and made workers aware of the change in process. Environmental health staff also helped the restaurant find an appropriate place to store the butter product. So the information gained from the environmental health component of this investigation likely helped prevent future illnesses in this restaurant. But aggregated with other data like these from all over the country, these kinds of data can also be used to inform interventions and prevent outbreaks at a larger scale through food worker training programs and food safety regulations, for example. Some data from environmental health outbreak investigation activities have been collected and analyzed at the national level, but much of the data have not been collected and analyzed in a systematic way. Thus, in 2014, CDC's National Center for Environmental Health developed a reporting system called NEARS to collect these data from environmental health specialists. NEARS collects a number of data points from environmental health components of outbreak investigations. The data include information on the outbreak itself, including agent, food, of course, any contributing factors identified, the outbreak establishment, including basic characteristics like the number of meals served, and food safety characteristics such as policies and practices, and the outbreak investigation, including a description of activities conducted and how quickly the investigation was initiated. From 2014 to 2016, 15 state and local jurisdictions reported 404 outbreaks to NEARS. I'm going to present some descriptive data from this data set. Investigations identified an agent in about 77% of outbreaks, so 311 of them. And of these agents, most were confirmed. Most identified agents were viral, 62%, followed by bacterial and toxic, chemical, or other. Overall, norovirus was the most common agent, accounting for 61% of outbreaks where an agent was identified. The second most common was salmonella, followed by Clostridium perfringens. These findings are fairly similar to national outbreak data reported to CDC. This graph shows the top 5 contributing factors reported to NEARS. The most common contributing factors were, first, bare hand contact by an infectious food worker, other mode of contamination by a food worker suspected of being infectious, glove hand contact by an infectious worker, cross-contamination of ingredients, and insufficient time or temperature during cooking. Contamination of food by ill workers contributed to more than half of outbreaks with contributing factors. These findings are similar to national outbreak data reported to CDC. Both NEARS and other CDC data highlight the role of workers in viral outbreaks and indicate the need for continued focus on reducing viral foodborne illness outbreaks by protecting food from worker contamination. Most of the establishments with outbreaks were independently owned and serve complex food items. So the food requires a kill step, a process such as cooking that reduces or eliminates the foodborne pathogens, and other food preparation processes such as cooling or reheating. More than half of the establishments serve less than or equal to 200 meals daily. The remaining establishments serve more. These data can contribute to formulating hypotheses about the context in which these outbreaks occur. For example, the proportion of establishments with outbreaks engaging in complex food preparation processes is high compared with the proportion of establishments without outbreaks engaging in these processes, which is approximately half, found in other studies. This difference suggests that outbreaks might be more likely in establishments where complex food preparation occurs. Although research comparing establishments with and without outbreaks is necessary to confirm these hypotheses, these preliminary comparisons indicate the potential value of NEARS data for developing and testing hypotheses about outbreak characteristics. NEARS collects data on whether establishments have policies designed to reduce foodborne illness risk. Here you see data on policies that limit opportunities for food workers to contaminate food. These are of particular interest because ill workers are a frequent contributor to outbreaks. About half of the establishments had a written policy and about a third had a verbal policy to prevent ill workers from handling food, so restriction, or to prevent them from working, so exclusion. More than half of establishments with outbreaks had a written policy, and about a third had a verbal policy requiring food workers to notify their manager when they are ill. Here you see data on whether establishments have policies regarding disposable glove use. Appropriate glove use can prevent worker contamination of food. The majority of establishments with outbreaks had a verbal policy concerning disposable glove use. An additional third had a written policy. So most establishments with outbreaks had policies preventing those who are ill from working and on glove use. But relatively few of those establishments with outbreaks had the policies in writing. It may be that the form of policy might have a role in effectiveness. Research suggests that written policies are more effective than unwritten ones. Written food safety policies might indicate prioritization of food safety or institutionalized policies and practices. 3/4 of environmental assessments were completed in 1 or 2 visits to the establishment. The remaining were completed in 3 or more visits. Investigators contacted most of the establishments with outbreaks the same day they were identified for an environmental assessment. For the remaining establishment, contact occurred in 1 to 2 days or 3 or more days after identification. The fact that for most outbreaks, investigators initiated an environmental assessment quickly is positive because experts recommend initiating environmental assessments as quickly as possible. But for some outbreaks, investigators took considerably longer to initiate contacts, suggesting a need for improvement in timeliness of environmental assessments. And CDC does provide a free interactive training on outbreak environmental assessments. It's a first step for health departments seeking to improve investigation practices. NEARS provides unique data on establishments that have had foodborne illness outbreaks. These data increase knowledge about the environmental context of the outbreaks, and they contribute to generating hypotheses about their causes and prevention. Because NEARS data identify gaps in food safety policies and practices, and types of establishments vulnerable to outbreaks. They also can help target training and interventions for state and local food safety programs and the retail food establishment industry. For example, the data suggests that outbreaks might be more likely in establishments using complex food preparation. Finally, NIRS data can identify gaps in environmental health investigation practices, such as delayed environmental assessments. Identifying these gaps can help investigators target their improvement efforts. In the future, we want to use NIRS data to one, compare characteristics of establishments with and without outbreaks, examine relationships between establishments and their epidemiologic characteristics like outbreak size, and compare bacterial and viral outbreaks. These activities will contribute to understanding the role of these factors in outbreaks. CDC is developing these analyses, and information gained from them can help public health authorities develop data-based effective approaches to prevention of foodborne illness outbreaks. I've got some links here if you want to learn more. The first is just more about the NIRS program, and then the second bullet is publications that have resulted from the NIRS data. And then I mentioned CDC's training for kind of the first step for health departments wanting to learn more about the environmental assessment process. It takes about 8 to 10 hours to complete. There are CEUs available, and it's a very interactive, fun, and educational training. And with that, I want to thank you for inviting us to participate, and I'll take any questions that you have.
Do we have any questions? Okay, it looks like we have one in the chat. Is the CDC performing additional studies with more current outbreak data to identify changes and trends with foodborne illness outbreaks?
I believe one of my colleagues is on the line with me, Dr. Laura Brown, who may be able to speak more to that.
Yes, hi. CDC has done some work on this topic, and we did find a pretty dramatic decrease in this study, I think specifically looked at norovirus, but a pretty dramatic decrease in norovirus outbreaks during the pandemic. I don't have the details. I could certainly get them and send them to the organizers. And that has started to tick back up, of course, but yes, the pandemic certainly did impact outbreak trends. And of course, we are continuing to collect outbreak data, and we release annual or semi-annual reports, and I can send a link to where you can find those reports as well.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, I don't see any in the chat, so that concludes the IEHA conference, day 3, and we'll reconvene on Thursday for the 4th and final day. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you on Thursday.